Hi, good evening, everyone. So I'm just going to wait it out for about 2-3 minutes before we finally start off the talk. And just want to ensure before I start whether I'm audible and clearly visible to all. So if I am, please do give me a thumbs up. And just in case I'm not, please do let me know. I'm really depending on you guys for this. So I see some people joining in now. Thank you. Thank you. So I hope I'm taking all the waves to mean that I'm clearly audible and visible. So I don't think that should be a problem. Just a couple of minutes more before we start. Thank you. Thank you, Anki Sharma. That's very kind of you. Thank you. All right. So I think now that we've waited for a couple of minutes, I'll introduce myself quickly without taking much time, and then we can kick things off. So I'm Siddhant Bajaj. I am currently engaged as an associate in the dispute resolution team of LNL Partners Law Offices, formerly known as Luthra and Luthra, as you'd all know. And today I'd be talking about whether the concept of seat of arbitration, sits well within the context and the idea of domestic arbitration. So so whether the situs, I mean, there are a lot of ways in which you can refer to a seat. Juridical seat of arbitration, situs of arbitration, locus arbitri, by whatever name you may want to call it. I'm just going to be talking about and exploring whether that concept really fits within the context of domestic arbitration. And I'm also going to be talking about very briefly on how that concept was read into Indian law, how that was introduced into Indian law, and whether that was done so correctly or not. And I'm just going to be talking about my opinion here from a very academical standpoint. So it is my humble opinion that the concept of seat of arbitration has little to no applicability in the context of domestic arbitration within India. And that it also finds no acceptance in the bare text or the bare language of the 1996 Act, the current Arbitration Act that governs the procedural law relating to arbitration within India. So I believe that the concept of seat really has been, over the course of the last decade or so, been read into the Arbitration Act by successive judicial pronouncements. There's been a steady stream of judgments which have not only introduced this idea into Indian law, but have also built upon this idea by quite a bit. And I mean, again, this entire talk is an endeavor to just justify my view that this concept doesn't sit very well within the context of Indian arbitration. I'd be building a case by journeying through these various judicial landmarks to probably convey the point that maybe this concept is not as baked into Indian arbitration jurisprudence as one would think it to be. But before I begin, a little foreword is necessary. So when I speak of domestic arbitration, I am referring to arbitration other than international commercial arbitration, and I'm borrowing from the definition of international commercial arbitration or domestic arbitration as provided in the 1996 Act. So any reference to domestic arbitration, at least in this talk, is to be construed as a reference to arbitration solely in India, within Indian parties, within the umbrella of one single uniform curial law. Now, as we all know, in the more traditional federal states, different states may have different arbitration laws. They may have different sets of laws. However, India is a quasi-federal setup. Therefore, we follow a single system of laws across the length and breadth of our country. And therefore, whenever I speak about domestic arbitration, I am not really referring to domestic or whatever is considered domestic arbitration in other jurisdictions. Because whatever I am going to say through the course of this lecture or talk may not hold true for those countries, but it definitely does hold true, at least in my opinion, for India. So arbitration within the confines of a single uniform legal system, within a single jurisdiction between parties belonging to that single jurisdiction is what I am primarily going to be talking about. So starting at the start, I'd like to begin the talk by talking about a case called Hakam Singh versus Gamon India. This is a judgment of the Supreme Court dating back to 1971. Now, but before discussing and before starting off a discussion on this judgment, I just want to quickly explore what can be the possible benefits of a seat designation within the concept of within domestic law, or in general why in international law and international arbitrations the concept of seat is so prevalent and how it works. So the concept of seat brings with it various advantages, such as neutrality. It brings a favorable set of laws, a favorable curial law, reduced prospects of parallel litigation, and time economy, to name a few. However, I don't really think that the designation of seat within a domestic concept brings any of these advantages with it. And I'm going to be explaining that, I'm going to be fleshing that out further through the course of this talk. However, one possible advantage at the outset that I can think of is the possibility of forum selection. So the moment you designate a seat, you are vesting the courts of a certain jurisdiction within the nation with the power of supervisory jurisdiction over your arbitration proceedings. So before we explore the concept of seat any further, it is very important to see whether Indian law originally dehors the idea of seat, dehors the concept of seat, actually allows for forum selection. And this is where the judgment of Hakam Singh versus Gamon India becomes instructive. So to quickly take you through the facts of this case, the appellant, basis a written tender, had agreed to carry out certain construction work for the respondent. Now the tender or the contract between the parties had a stipulation that the courts in Mumbai alone will have jurisdiction to adjudicate upon the disputes arising from the contract between the parties. Now disputes arose between the parties, and the appellant sought reference of the disputes to arbitration from the Court of Subordinate Judge in Varanasi under Section 20 of the erstwhile Arbitration Act, that is the 1940 Arbitration Act. So the subordinate judge then concluded that the entire cause of action had arisen in Varanasi really, and the parties by agreement could not have conferred jurisdiction upon the courts of Mumbai because the courts of Mumbai did not possess jurisdiction or were not clothed with jurisdiction as per the CPC. So things were a little different when the matter went to the High Court of Allahabad. The High Court of Allahabad set aside the order and held that the courts in Mumbai did have exclusive jurisdiction over the disputes arising from the contract between the party, and therefore, aggrieved by this order, the appellant takes the matter all the way up to the Supreme Court. Now, the judgment that was rendered by the Supreme Court on Hakam Singh is very interesting. I'm just going to be quoting one single paragraph of that judgment. That's paragraph 4, the most relevant one out of all. The paragraph reads as follows, and I quote, "It is not open to the parties by agreement to confer jurisdiction on a court which it does not possess under the code. But where two or more courts have jurisdiction under the Code of Civil Procedure to try a suit or proceedings, an agreement between the parties that the dispute between them shall be tried in one such court is not contrary to public policy. Such an agreement does not contravene Section 28 of the Contract Act." Now, however, on the facts of the case, the court did find that Mumbai indeed had jurisdiction, but that was linked to Section 20A of the CPC because of a head office or something being located in Mumbai, I'm sorry. But that is entirely irrelevant to the declaratory principle that has come out of this judgment. So the key takeaways from this judgment really are the following. It is that parties cannot by agreement confer jurisdiction on a court which it naturally does not possess under the CPC. And the second is where two or more courts do indeed have jurisdiction arising from the CPC, then by agreement the parties can confer exclusive jurisdiction on one of those courts. So Hakam Singh really lays down a conditio sine qua non of selecting a court to exercise exclusive jurisdiction. And that sine qua non is that the court which is chosen to exercise exclusive jurisdiction must be a court that possesses that jurisdiction under the Code of Civil Procedure. Now, because Hakam Singh is a judgment that dates all the way back to 1971, that's a few decades ago, one might ask, how is it relevant in the present times? And maybe it has lost its relevance, law has evolved from there, and maybe Hakam Singh is not really as applicable in today's time as it was back in 1971. So I need to underscore 2 points to highlight the relevance of Hakam Singh in contemporary times. So the first of these points is that the judgment rendered in Hakam Singh has not been overruled, and till date it remains a binding precedent. The second is that even though the judgment was delivered in context of the erstwhile, the 1940 Arbitration Act, it does remain in principle applicable to the present 1996 Act as well. So I'll first be talking about the contemporary reliance that has been placed on Hakam Singh in judgments that have been rendered post 2010. So the front runner among these is a judgment called Swastik Gases Private Limited versus Indian Oil Corporation Limited. Now in this case, the Supreme Court was faced with the question whether the usage of words such as sole, exclusive, only, etc. is essential to vest exclusive jurisdiction on a particular court. Now the Supreme Court, while answering this question negatively, heavily relied on the principle laid down in Hakam Singh and said the following, and I'm quoting again from the judgment. It says, where the contract specifies the jurisdiction of the courts at a particular place and such courts have jurisdiction to deal with the matter, we think that an inference may be drawn that parties intended to exclude all other courts. A clause like this is not hit by Section 23 of the Contract Act at all. Such clause is neither forbidden by law, nor is it against public policy. It does not offend Section 28 of the Contract Act in any manner. And having said so, the court went on to cite various other judgments that had actually relied on the principle, the primary principle that was laid down in Hakam Singh. Now there are a few more judgments, and these, by the way, these judgments all come after there has already been a departure from Hakam Singh. So in spirit, the courts or the Supreme Court of India has departed from the principle laid down in Hakam Singh, but these judgments come even after those judgments that have departed from Hakam Singh. To name a few more, for example, there are B.E. Simos versus Chhattisgarh Investment Limited, there's Patel Roadways Limited versus Prasad Trading Company, and so on. These are all Supreme Court judgments. Now, in fact, one of the judgments that has in principle gone against the principle relied on in Hakam Singh, that would be Indus Mobile Distribution Private Limited versus Datawind Innovation, has relied on a judgment that follows Hakam Singh to the T, and that is Swastik Gases. So there is a strange kind of contradiction in law that is developing after Hakam Singh, and that has developed especially after 2012 when a judgment called Balco versus Kaiser came into the picture. But anyway, I digress. Coming back to the contemporary relevance of Hakam Singh, now I want to expound upon how Hakam Singh in principle is applicable to the 1996 Act, even though Hakam Singh was passed in context of the 1940 Act. So first of all, the principle that was laid down in Hakam Singh is entirely declaratory. It's an exposition on public policy and will thus be applicable to all situations where more than one court has jurisdiction, natural jurisdiction arising from the CPC to adjudicate upon disputes. So it has general applicability that way. That's why it's relevant. However, when we trace the genesis of the definition of court, as it is in the 1996 Act in Section 21E, we realize, and what becomes clear from analyzing it is, that it has remained for all practical purposes the same definition as was adopted in the 1940 Act. So the definition of court really hasn't changed much. So I'll be reading out the definition now as it existed in the 1940 Act, and the definition goes something like this. Court means, and this was in 2C of the 1940 Act, it says, court means a civil court having jurisdiction to decide the questions forming the subject matter of reference if the same had been the subject matter of a suit, but does not, except for the purpose of arbitration proceedings under Section 21, include a small cause court. Now the definition of court under 21E is more or less near about the same, and it reads as follows. Court means the principal civil court of original jurisdiction in a district and includes the High Court in exercise of its ordinary original civil jurisdiction, having jurisdiction to decide the questions forming the subject matter of the arbitration if the same had been the subject matter of a suit, but does not include any civil court of a grade inferior to such principal civil court or any civil court of small causes. Now, therefore, on an analysis of both these judgments, we realize that in Hakam Singh, the judgment that the court was dealing with, the core definition of court that the bench rendering Hakam Singh was dealing with, has primarily remained unchanged from that point all the way up till now. There has been an amendment to the definition of court in the present Act, in the 1996 Act, by way of the 2015 Amendment to the Arbitration Act, but all that amendment really did to this definition was that it bifurcated the definition of court for the purposes of domestic arbitration and international commercial arbitration. But the core definition really has not been changed or touched. The 2019 amendment, following in the heels of the 2015 amendment, also does not change the core definition of court. So Hakam Singh really remains in principle applicable to the present act as well. Now, one may argue that unlike the 1940 Act, the 1996 Act specifically excludes the operation of the CPC by virtue of Section 19 thereof. This argument really wouldn't stand in my opinion, because insofar as the applicability of Hakam Singh is concerned, Section 19 of the 1996 Act only lays down that the arbitral tribunal is not bound to follow the strictures of the CPC or the Indian Evidence Act, but nowhere does the Act say that the CPC will be wholly inapplicable while deciding a court to exercise supervisory jurisdiction over arbitration proceedings. So the correct manner of identifying a court for the purposes of exercising said supervisory jurisdiction is that a party, while doing so, has to presume that the questions forming the subject matter of the arbitration were the subject matter of a suit. So you have to see whether what court would have exercised jurisdiction had the questions forming the subject matter of the arbitration been the subject matter of a suit. Now, in my humble opinion, that really cannot be done de horse the CPC. So the CPC really has to be brought in and remains squarely applicable insofar as the definition of court goes for the purposes of Section 21E. Now, having spoken about the Hakam Singh judgment and having explained that Indian law allows for forum selection to a limited extent, and how Hakam Singh as a judgment remains applicable and relevant today as well, never has been overruled, it has and it also remains in principle applicable to the 1996 Act. I am now going to be talking about the judgment that really sowed the seed of seat in domestic arbitration. This is the judgment that introduces the idea of seat into Indian arbitration jurisprudence, and this judgment is Bharat Aluminium Company versus Kaiser Aluminium Technical Services. This really, in my opinion, is the beginning of that snowball effect, which is seat in domestic arbitration. Now, just to briefly go through the facts of what happened in this case, an agreement was executed between Bharat Aluminium, BALCO, and Kaiser, which contained a dispute resolution clause, which provided for arbitration proceedings to be held in London in the English language, and the contract between the parties also provided that this agreement will be governed by the prevailing law in India, and in the case of arbitration, English law shall apply. Now, the tribunal seated in London had passed 2 awards against BALCO, which BALCO decided to get set aside by way of Section 34 proceedings in a district court in Bilaspur. Now, the district court rejected BALCO's application as not maintainable, saying that such an application did not really withstand the arbitral awards that had been passed in a London-seated arbitration. So the matter then gets taken to the High Court of Chhattisgarh, which also rejects BALCO's appeal, saying that the applications filed by the appellants under Section 34 of the Indian Act are not maintainable against 2 foreign awards. So BALCO, obviously aggrieved by this, approaches the Supreme Court of India. Now, along with BALCO's case, there was another appeal which was listed along with this matter, clubbed for hearing together with BALCO's appeal, and this was the case of Bharti Shipyard Limited versus Ferrostal AG. In this case, the facts were in principle similar. Arbitration proceedings were being conducted under the rules of the London Maritime Arbitrators Association in London, and the arbitration proceedings were pending. However, what Bharti Shipyard Limited did was that it moved a Section 9 in a district court in Bangalore. The application was allowed by the district judge, and the same was then assailed before the High Court of Bangalore, which set aside the application on the grounds that the appellant, which is Bharti Shipyard in this case, had an alternate remedy under Section 44 of the UK Arbitration Act. So essentially the High Court said, please go back to the UK, that is your seat, that is where the arbitration is being conducted, you can't move a Section 9 here. So then now comes the judgment that was delivered in BALCO, and BALCO is a groundbreaking judgment in a lot of ways. It's very popular, it's very relevant. So in this case, the Supreme Court had analyzed in detail the various provisions of the Arbitration Act, and especially the applicability of Part 1 to proceedings under Part 2, and the application of Part 1 of the Arbitration Act to arbitration seated outside India. And I'm just going to be briefly going through some of the relevant and significant observations, of which there are many, which came out of BALCO. So the first of these is that the court observed that Section 2.7 of the Arbitration Act distinguishes between a foreign award, which is governed by Part 1, which distinguishes between a domestic award, which is governed by Part 1, and a foreign award, which is governed by Part 2 of the Arbitration Act. Now, it was noted that 2.7 does not distinguish between domestic award from an international award rendered in India. So essentially what the court ended up saying was, and rightly so, that part 1 deals with two kinds of awards. It deals with purely domestic awards, which means awards rendered in arbitrations between two Indian parties, and everything remains Indian. There is absolutely no foreign element to the arbitration. And secondly, India seated international commercial arbitration. So these are the two kinds of awards that are dealt with under part 1 of the Act. And then foreign awards, which means awards rendered in arbitrations seated outside of India, are dealt with under part 2 of the Act. The second observation was that part 1 and part 2 of the Arbitration Act are complete codes unto themselves. They don't overlap, they are watertight, and they're not dependent in any manner on each other. Therefore, any arbitration to which part 1 would apply would be an arbitration to which part 2 will simply not apply. And therefore, the Supreme Court pushed this watertight distinction between part 1 and part 2. Then the Supreme Court goes on to draw a distinction between seat and venue, which is crucial. Anybody who's handled arbitration matters before would know that sometimes dispute resolution clauses, arbitration clauses in commercial contracts or contracts in general are worded very nebulously. Their meaning really is not very clear. So the court said that the word seat and venue would have to be distinguished, and if there is a situation where a party having chosen or parties having chosen a foreign seat of arbitration decide to follow the Indian Arbitration Act, then for all practical purposes that Indian Arbitration Act would simply be the rules of procedure which would be followed in the arbitration, not to be conflated with the procedural laws, only the rules of procedure. So that would be the case if such a nebulous arbitration clause is created. So the conclusion that part 1 of the Arbitration Act does not apply to foreign seated arbitrations resulted from a detailed analysis of the UN Citral Model Law. Basis this analysis, the court underscored two fundamental propositions, and these are as follows. The application of the UN Citral Model Law was intended to be limited to the territorial jurisdiction of the seat of arbitration, that is, the territoriality principle. And second, that the seat of arbitration is the center of gravity. The seat of arbitration is really the sun of the arbitral solar system. And therefore, to an extent, arbitrations are not subject matter centric, they are seat centric. That is something that came out of Balco. Now, Balco is famous for another reason, and that is for overruling the much criticized Bhatia and Venture Global decisions, which had adopted a rather interventionist approach in terms of foreign arbitrations in India. The courts in this, the Supreme Court in these cases had said that Indian courts would have jurisdiction with respect to foreign seated arbitration akin to their curial jurisdiction over arbitrations seated within India governed by Part 1, unless the parties had an express agreement to the contrary. So in case two parties who have chosen a foreign seat of arbitration don't have an agreement to say that Indian courts will not exercise jurisdiction over this arbitration, Indian courts would by default have jurisdiction over those arbitrations. So these decisions were set aside by Balco, and it was lauded for this reason. Now, since Balco is at the vanguard of introducing the concept of seat within domestic arbitration, before I discuss how Balco did so and whether it introduced the idea of seat wrongly or rightly within Indian domestic arbitral jurisprudence, I just quickly want to run through in a little more detail the advantages or the benefits that come from seat designation in international arbitration. So seat, and what does it really do? The seat determines the curial law of the arbitration, or the lex arbitri as we call it, and it acts as the territorial link between the arbitration itself and the law of the place in which that arbitration is legally situated. So the concept of seat is relevant to international arbitration because international arbitration by its nature is a highly delocalized process. Why? Because multiple parties, multiple laws, multiple jurisdictions, and therefore it all becomes a hot mess of different laws of different nations which are very hard to kind of reconcile. And so what arbitration does what the designation of seat does is it anchors or pins down the concept or the framework of arbitration to the laws of a specific nation, provides more order to the entire framework. There is this line from Redfern and Hunter which I really like, and I'll be reading it out, and it goes like this. Designation of seat gives an established legal framework to an international arbitration so that instead of floating in the transnational firmament unconnected with any municipal system of law, the arbitration is firmly anchored in a given judicial system. So that is something that the designation of seat does for an arbitration. But does that concept apply to domestic arbitration? I believe the answer has to be a no, because when you are arbitrating in a domestic framework, when the parties are Indian, when the law is Indian, when the act that is applicable to your arbitration is the Indian Arbitration Act, you really cannot, you don't have a choice to choose between different curial laws. So I may be sitting in Mumbai and choose my seat as Delhi, and that really will not change the application of the law that is applicable to me. It wouldn't change the law that is applicable to me, which will be the Arbitration Act. So you can't opt for different curial laws within a nation. Now, there are certain factors and considerations that go into choosing a seat, and I'll quickly be running through those also. So first is neutrality. Now, there is something that most parties in international arbitration fear, and that is called local party bias. Parties from two different jurisdictions which don't belong to the same legal tradition, for example, a civil law country and a common law country, would always try to opt for a neutral third option to conduct their arbitration in, and to adopt the laws of a neutral third nation, which can really provide them a neutral venue and not prejudice them in any manner whatsoever. Again, does this concept apply to domestic arbitration, or would this consideration go into domestic arbitration? I think the answer has to be in the negative, because if both the parties are Indian, I don't think they'd face any bias coming from different courts in this country. And even if they would, I understand some parties do have that apprehension. Maybe a party sitting somewhere in South India would feel that a court up in North India might display some sort of bias against them, or there might be some sort of communication barrier or something of that sort. I don't think that those apprehensions can be given statutory acceptance, because the moment you give it statutory acceptance, you are statutorily recognizing the principle that the Indian judiciary or Indian courts can display that kind of a bias, and that parties need to exercise their due diligence before selecting courts, and a parties beware sort of a situation. And I don't think that that's a valid ground for introducing the idea of seat into Indian law. The second, as I've said above, is curial law. Now, curial law decides a lot of things. The curial law of the country which you choose as the seat of arbitration will decide the extent of the intervention of courts, or rather the kind of assistance that courts can provide you, the scope of judicial review, especially on the grounds of public policy, and the procedure for appointing arbitrators, interim measures, so on and so forth. So that is, those are the considerations that kind of go in while selecting a seat of arbitration. Just to give an example, Switzerland is a very popular seat of arbitration. Why? Because if a party really wants to ensure the sanctity of their award, and they really want to ensure that it doesn't get set aside on frivolous, flimsy grounds, they usually flock to Switzerland, because the appeal procedure or the setting aside procedure, the annulment procedure in Switzerland is quite cut and dry. It's not exactly very easy to go through with. Firstly, there's a 30-day limitation. The appeal will directly go to the Federal Supreme Court of Switzerland, and the success rate is almost 100 to 1 sort of a situation. So that is one consideration that goes into selecting a seat. But does that apply within India, and does that apply to domestic arbitrations? I'd say no, because Indian courts are bound by the judgments of the Supreme Court. They are bound by the same laws that are enacted by the legislature, and one court cannot be enforcing an award in principle differently from another court. And therefore, you can't say that I want to opt for a different court because I just feel that the sanctity of my award will be upheld by one court better than it would be by another court. And moreover, if you think that a court has erred in deciding upon your award, you can always take the matter up to the Supreme Court. So that option is open to parties. Then there are other considerations. For example, beyond the technicalities of neutrality and the technicalities of curial law, there are factors such as efficiency of the courts of the seat, the availability of legal experts and arbitrators at the place of arbitration, the availability of arbitral infrastructure, and so on. Now, as far as infrastructure goes, in the context of India, domestic arbitrations, that problem can very easily be surpassed by choosing an appropriate venue for the arbitration. Now, if I am a party with its operations in, let's say, Chhattisgarh, and I believe that Delhi would provide me with better logistics and better support for my arbitration, and maybe the availability of experts in Delhi would be greater, I can simply move the venue of my arbitration to Delhi and say that all the hearings and all the proceedings of the arbitration will be conducted in Delhi. So that's a problem solved. Second is the efficiency of courts. Now, I may believe that certain courts in certain cities are better equipped to handle commercial disputes or hyper-technical disputes which arise in certain specialized arbitrations, and certain cities will not be able to provide me with that kind of expertise. But then again, the moment we statutorily recognize that, it becomes a slippery slope. It makes the process of selecting a seat of arbitration, or it makes the process of arbitration subject to the whims and fancies of parties, gives them a lot of leeway to stall proceedings as and when they feel it's required. Any party can at any point in time raise a frivolous ground and say that, oh, I don't want to select XYZ as a seat because I don't trust the judiciary or I don't trust the courts of a particular state of this country. Moreover, it is to be understood that we live in times of the Commercial Courts Act, and arbitration matters are usually now taken to the commercial courts. So even if the delivery of justice in arbitration matters is not the same across the nation, it's at least now comparable, and the legislature has made an attempt to keep it that way. In the international context, the training and the expertise of judges would really make a huge difference. Some judges and some arbitrators may be trained in commercial law traditions, some would be trained in civil law traditions, Islamic law traditions, and so on. And that really would have a bearing on the choice of seat between parties in international arbitrations. But I don't think any of that really applies to domestic arbitration. And therefore, while a lot of lucrative arguments may be advanced for the introduction of seat in domestic arbitration, I don't think any of them are compelling enough to actually introduce the concept of seat within domestic arbitrations. So now that I've explained the position of Indian law with regard to forum selection, the fact that Hakam Singh and the judgments that followed Hakam Singh allow for a limited amount of forum selection to take place, and the fact that arbitration, at least the designation of seat in domestic arbitration has little to no relevance, I will now kind of explain the nuts and bolts of how the judgment of Balco really introduces the concept of seat in domestic arbitration. Now, the Supreme Court, while deciding Balco, was dealing only with an international arbitration seated outside India. Nothing in the appeals brought before the Supreme Court entailed any question regarding domestic arbitration. Now, of course, it's always open for a court to go beyond the facts before it and make comments here and there. But if there is a contextually inappropriate example, which is left inadequately explained or entirely explained for that matter, it can create interpretational hurdles in future, and that is exactly what happened in the case of Balco. And this is not just my analysis, this confusion is apparent from the judgments that follow Balco, and I'll be talking about them through the course of my talk. Now, the bench in Balco was dealing with an argument on the importance given to party autonomy by the 1996 Act, and whether Part 1 of the 1996 Act would or should apply to arbitration seated outside India, and whether the 1996 Act is subject matter centric or exclusively seat centric. So that was the question before the court, and that was what the court was dealing with. So the court begins its analysis by quoting the pre-2015 amendment section 21E of the 1996 Act, and goes on to state the following, and I'm going to be quoting this, para 96 obviously being the most important and relevant part of the judgment. So the first part of para 96, this is the first half of para 96, says the following. We are of the opinion that the term subject matter of arbitration cannot be confused with subject matter of the suit. The term subject matter in section 21E is confined to part 1. It has reference and connection with the process of dispute resolution. Its purpose is to identify courts having supervisory control over the arbitration proceedings. So far, there is absolutely no problem. The problem begins with the next line, which is, hence it refers to a court which would essentially be a court of the seat of the arbitration process. So this is where the court really for the first time bases the bare text of 21E as it stood then and as it at its core stands now, introduced the concept of seat to domestic arbitration. Now there are certain problems which arise from this. Oh, just one more thing. After saying, hence it refers to a court which would essentially be a court of the seat of the arbitration process, the court also says, in our opinion, the provision of section 21E has to be construed keeping in view the provision of section 20, which gives recognition to party autonomy. Accepting the narrow construction as projected by the parties would render section 20 nugatory. So another thing that the court is doing is they're using section 20 of the Arbitration Act to interpret a definition provided under 21E. Now I'll quickly go through what the problems are with this paragraph. The court doesn't really explain the difference between subject matter of arbitration and subject matter of a suit. It simply says that by virtue of the existence of the word subject matter of arbitration, in section 21E, it somewhere implies that 21E recognizes the seat court, apart from recognizing the court which has jurisdiction as per the CPC. Now, there are two differences that come to mind. And the first of these differences is actually not a difference, it's an antithesis of a difference, which is that subject matter of suit is broader than subject matter of arbitration. Why? Because there is a concept called arbitrability of disputes. And if we've gone through judgments such as Ayaswamy versus Parmasivam and Booz Allen and so on, we know that not all disputes are arbitrable. But whatever is not arbitrable can very well be decided by a court by way of a suit. Therefore, the subject matter of suit will subsume the subject matter of arbitration. And so far, this sits in harmony with the plain wordings of section 21E. The next difference, and this is the more plausible one, which the proponents of the concept of seat may use to bolster their arguments for the relevance of seat in the domestic context, is that there are certain aspects of arbitrations which simply cannot be dealt with by courts. And these are aspects of arbitration which only a tribunal can look at. For instance, applications under section 13, 16, 17 of the Arbitration Act, any cause of action arising from adjudication upon these applications, the applications themselves solely fall within the remit of the arbitral tribunal, and the court cannot really look into these things, and therefore the subject matter of arbitration can very well be distinguished from subject matter of suit, and there is a tangible difference between the two. However, in my opinion, this argument will also not stand because we need to go back to the intent of section 21E. Section 21E defines the term court. It will naturally not take anything into account which a court cannot possibly look into. So section 21E will only consider those things which can both be taken up in an arbitration, which can form the subject matter of arbitration, and can simultaneously also form the subject matter of a suit. So the court relied on its reading of subject matter of arbitration to suggest that jurisdiction may be conferred on courts within whose territorial jurisdiction arbitration takes place, or courts of the place of arbitration are situated. This is clear from the first three lines of para 97. Para 97 goes as follows. The definition of 21E includes subject matter of arbitration to give jurisdiction to courts where the arbitration takes place, which otherwise would not exist. So the court itself now is going against the CPC by saying which otherwise would not exist. So they're acknowledging that the jurisdiction which a seat court will have is not granted to it by the CPC. It exists simply by virtue of the fact that there is a subject matter of arbitration which can't be the subject matter of a suit, and therefore the legislature, while inserting the words subject matter of arbitration into 21E, have acknowledged the relevance of seat courts and have given it statutory recognition and acceptance. Now, there is obviously this whole problem of where the court gets this distinction from, and the intent of section 21E, and the fact that you can't include within the fold of section 21E things that a court cannot do because the section is wholly devised for the purpose of selecting a court to exercise supervisory jurisdiction over arbitrations. But the problems don't really end there. The bench in Balco obviously was a constitutional bench, and being a constitutional bench of a greater strength than the one that delivered Hakam Singh, could very well have overruled Hakam Singh. It could have very well gone against all the judgments that followed Hakam Singh, but it did not. It actually does not even mention the Hakam Singh judgment, so it's completely unaddressed. So what comes out of Balco is that Balco here is going against a settled principle of law in India. It's a declaratory principle of law. It's a public policy oriented principle of law. While doing nothing to overrule Hakam Singh or to go against it or to alter it or modify it in any manner whatsoever. So therefore, it's a very strange situation where even after Balco, Hakam Singh subsists, survives, and then is followed by judgments which are delivered after Balco. So it creates a very rocky situation that way. So now I'll just give you my opinion and my thoughts on what the true import of section 21E ought to be. So the true import of section 21E is that a court must naturally have jurisdiction arising from the CPC to decide upon the substance/subject matter of a dispute in order for it to have supervisory jurisdiction over an arbitration involving the same substance or subject matter. Now this view, it's not something that I've come up with solely. I was guided by certain judgments which came pre-Balco, and these are judgments of lower courts, these are judgments of smaller benches, and have no precedential authority over Balco, but in my opinion still, they lay down the correct position of law. One of these judgments is Sushil Ansal versus Union of India. This is a Delhi High Court judgment. And the Delhi High Court made a very interesting observation in this judgment, and I'm going to be quoting that observation, which is that one has to ascertain what are the questions forming the subject matter of reference to arbitration which resulted in the award. Suppose those questions arise in a suit, then find out which would be the competent court to decide the suit. The court competent to decide such questions in the suit would be the court having jurisdiction to decide the present petition under the Arbitration Act for making the award in a rule of the court. Now, this judgment is followed subsequently in other judgments such as Gulati Construction Company, Jhansi versus Betwa River Board, and another GE Country Consumer Financial Services Limited versus Surjit Singh Bhatia, and another very interesting observation that comes from the Surjit Singh Bhatia judgment is the situs of arbitration or the fact that the award was made at a particular place would not be relevant for conferring jurisdiction. It is only the subject matter of the arbitration construed in a manner as if the arbitration proceedings were a suit that would be determinative of a court having jurisdiction to entertain and hear a petition under Section 34 of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. Now, these judgments, in my opinion, really are what the true intent and purpose and purport of Section 21E was, and this is the only way to read Section 21E harmoniously with the precedent that has been established by Hakam Singh and all the judgments that follow Hakam Singh. Besides the distinction between the terms subject matter of arbitration and subject matter of suit being unwarranted by the intent of Section 21E, there is now an example that is given in the latter half of Para 96 of BALCO. And this example is particularly confusing. It's an example which has caused subsequent benches to deliver varying judgments. It has actually led to the Supreme Court overruling various High Court judgments. And it has caused, in general, a lot of confusion about whether the Arbitration Act confers concurrent jurisdiction upon courts or it confers exclusive jurisdiction upon courts. So, Para 96 and the example given in Para 96 is as follows. The bench says, in our view, the legislature has intentionally given jurisdiction to two courts. That is, the court which would have jurisdiction where the cause of action is located and the courts where the arbitration takes place. This was necessary as on many occasions the agreement and so on. But it essentially talks about two courts having jurisdiction. This example is purely India-centric. It talks about Delhi, Kolkata and Mumbai. So it talks about parties from Delhi and Mumbai and Kolkata choosing Delhi as a seat of arbitration. And then goes on to say that in such a situation, two courts will exercise jurisdiction. One will be the court of the seat and the other will be the court which naturally has jurisdiction arising from the CPC, which is subject matter jurisdiction. So this causes a lot of confusion because ultimately BALCO goes on to say that the seat court shall have exclusive jurisdiction. But there is this one singular isolated paragraph which talks about concurrent jurisdiction, and that really kind of causes a lot of confusion. Now, the Calcutta High Court in a judgment called Devdas Raut, it's a 2018 judgment, has said, and it's actually resonated the view that I'm trying to put across here. In Para 63 of this judgment, the Calcutta High Court says, in a sense, the confusion was created, if it may be said with all humility, with a contextually inappropriate example at Para 96 of the judgment in BALCO. To begin with, the legal issue in BALCO was whether an arbitral award rendered in a foreign land could be assailed in any court in India under Section 34 of the 1996 Act. The larger issue involved in BALCO was the applicability of Part 1 of the 1996 Act to international arbitrations and foreign arbitral awards. In the context of legal issues that arose in BALCO, Section 21E of the 1996 Act was irrelevant, as the matter in BALCO pertained to international law, where the choice of the seat of arbitration reference determines the choice of the curial law or the law applicable to the conduct of arbitral reference and the outcome thereof, unless the parties otherwise agree. So the court says, and this is the High Court acknowledging that BALCO really wasn't kind of on the right track with this example. So, and also there is another problem with BALCO. When you analyze the whole judgment, you realize that prior to Para 96 and post Para 97, every authority that has been cited by the court or relied upon by the court are all authorities on international arbitration. None of them really are authorities on domestic arbitration. So it creates a strange situation where relying on international law authorities and international arbitration authorities, the UN Citral Model Law, the New York Convention, and generally laws pertaining to international arbitration, the court has somehow read the concept of seat into domestic arbitration without really explaining how this concept of international arbitration has been stitched into the fabric of domestic arbitration. So that, I believe, is quite a problem with this judgment. And I think really that this needs to be resolved and explained further. Now, there is one thought that came across my mind after analyzing Balco, and that is, are para 96 to 97 really a part of the ratio decidendi of this judgment? My conclusion is that they're not. And I've relied on a few authorities and a few ways to figure that out. One is a judgment called Dalbir Singh versus State of Punjab. It's a judgment which lays down the manner in which the ratio decidendi of a judgment is to be ascertained. And there are various tests, for example, the Wambog test, the Halsbury test, the Goodhart test, and so on. So what I did was, as an activity, just out of curiosity, I inverted the meaning of para 96 and para 97 of the judgment and saw whether they have an actual bearing on the final decision that was rendered in the case. And they don't. And so that leads me to the conclusion, personally, in my humble opinion, that these paragraphs are obiter comments and are not actually a part of the ratio decidendi of the judgment. So that really is my takeaway from Balco, and I think this needs to be explained a little further. Now, I'll be addressing just one more small little topic, and then I'll end this session because I think there's a 15-minute limitation, and I'll go live again thereafter. Should place of arbitration mean the same for domestic arbitrations and international commercial arbitrations? The answer, in my opinion, is no. They shouldn't. The place of arbitration should not mean the same for international commercial arbitration and domestic arbitration. Why? Because as recognized by Balco, Part 1 of the Arbitration Act actually deals with two kinds of awards: domestic awards and awards rendered in India-seated arbitrations. And I believe that in a domestic award rendered in an arbitration between parties who are Indian, we need to follow the principles of Indian public policy. We need to follow the well-settled principles of law that have been adopted and reiterated time and time again by the courts in India. Whereas in the case of international commercial arbitrations, place can actually mean seat of arbitration. Why? Because there is a foreign element in those arbitrations, and therefore there is conflict of laws, and there are multiple jurisdictions which are involved and multiple laws from various jurisdictions that are involved, and therefore place of arbitration can very well carry its traditional meaning. So the court in Balco has observed that the term place and seat can be used interchangeably. To say so, the court again relies on authorities relating to international commercial arbitration and does not use a single domestic law authority to say that place and seat can be used interchangeably. Does not go behind the intent of the legislature, does not really go too much into the bare text of the provision. It simply says that the word place, as used in Section 20 of the Arbitration Act, can very well mean seat of arbitration across the board. It can mean seat of arbitration for domestic arbitrations, and it can mean seat of arbitration for international commercial arbitrations. And that, in my opinion, is problematic, because you cannot, and this is a settled proposition of law, two parties cannot by a private contract supplant the provisions of substantive law. CPC is substantive law. Therefore, in domestic arbitrations, I don't think the meaning of place can be seat. It can be a court of competent jurisdiction or one court out of the multiple courts of competent jurisdiction, and that's the only way to read Section 21E and Section 20 and Section 42 of the Arbitration Act in harmony with the principles laid down in Hakam Singh. So I believe there that the meaning of these two terms should be entirely distinct. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to shortly talk about three other judgments which display clearly the confusion that has been caused in the wake of Balco, and then finally give my final word on what I consider to be the correct position of law. But for now, I'd be going off Instagram, and I'd be joining this session back. So if you're interested, please kind of sign in again.